TrustLine started with a mom and a couple of co-moms that worked together on creating this program, and they worked with an assembly member at the time, Mr. Agnos, and he sponsored the first piece of legislation back in 1986 that went into effect in 1987 that created TrustLine. So, and all of you began being involved with TrustLine at 25 years ago. So 25 years ago, TrustLine came to the network and came to all of you. And so it's been a quarter of a century that some of us have been working on TrustLine. We took TrustLine in its infancy, and can you believe that there have been a total of 13 pieces of legislation that made some modification to TrustLine over the years? Many times with TrustLine, I feel like I was rowing a boat in the middle of San Francisco Bay, and I would get out and I'm like, good, everything's going well, and the return times are going well, and then all of a sudden the tide would take me out, and I felt like I was rowing really hard to try to say, okay, now what are we gonna do to make TrustLine the most efficient and effective program possible? And I thank all of you for your commitment to TrustLine and working with us to make that program the best as it can be. So I felt like it was time, and I saw Meb earlier in this year, and we said we need to acknowledge our successes, and this is one of our successes among many over the years. So I'll let you know that there have been almost 450,000 applicants to TrustLine over the last 20 or 30 years, and 80,000 of those applicants have been closed because of criminal history or child abuse. And so I think that in and of itself is quite an accomplishment. And that doesn't even include all the people that screened themselves out. They said, I'm not going to get fingerprint. That's okay, I've decided not to do it, right? That doesn't count those folks. It's the folks that actually submitted their fingerprints to the Department of Justice. So we wanted to celebrate tonight with Mary Beth Phillips and her daughter Elizabeth Phillips and some special guests. And so I'm going to ask all of them to join me now up on stage, and they are each going to share with you their perspectives on TrustLine and honor Mary Beth and Elizabeth for this accomplishment. So I'd like to bring up Mary Beth Phillips, Elizabeth Phillips, former mayor of San Francisco, Agnos, and the first author of the first TrustLine legislation. I have Abby Cohen from the Administration of Children and Families. I have Shanice Orum from the California Department of Social Services, and I have Cecelia Fisher-Dahms from the California Department of Education. So please help me in welcoming the TrustLine team. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to the network and to CAPA. Tip it up. Okay, it's been a while since I've done this. Thank you to the network and to CAPA for inviting me and my daughter here to your annual conference to celebrate all of you and to celebrate the 30th anniversary of the TrustLine registry. Lao Tzu said that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And never was that more true than when my family started out on the journey to create what eventually became TrustLine. Never was that more true than the journey our family took after my daughter Elizabeth was shaken by a neighbor's nanny, and we started on the road to prevent that from ever happening to another family. So as I look out over this audience tonight, I am struck by the many faces of friends and colleagues that I know well. You are and you will always be my peeps. And I'm struck by the many new faces, people that I have yet to meet. And I wonder if when you provide information to a family coming to you for child care assistance, if you know the true story behind how TrustLine came to be. In 1983, I was in graduate school. I was very young. I was a genius graduate student, very young. I had one afternoon class that I needed childcare for, and I had hired a young woman from Mills College in Oakland to care for my baby while I attended class, which went from 2 to 5 p.m. in the afternoon. But she was on the semester system, and I was on the quarter system, and I had 2 classes more before I finished out the quarter. A neighbor, who was also a person who worked with my ex-husband at the local hospital, had a little girl who was 10 months old at the time, and Elizabeth was 6 months old at the time. This mother thought that since we were neighbors, it would be nice if we could share her live-in nanny, a person that she had hired several months before. So I left Liz at the neighbor's house a little before 2, and I came back to the house a little bit before 5 because we got out of class early to find that my daughter had been taken to Children's Hospital and she was in a comatose state. Our family later learned that Liz had been violently shaken, that she was a victim of shaken baby syndrome. Fast forward for a minute, I understand that the network is working on training modules, one of which is on shaken baby syndrome, and these will be available to child care providers. And I want to say thank you for that. Back when Liz was shaken and almost died, shaken baby syndrome was very new, and even the Berkeley doctors didn't really understand what happened to her at first. What we did know was that she was blind, she was paralyzed on the right side of her body, she was having seizures, and she was in a coma. I am glad that you can see that Liz is still very much with us. And I'm going to tell you, Liz is very much a miracle in my mind. Over time, I would say that if Elizabeth could work so hard to recover from the violence inflicted upon her, I too could learn to recover. If she could continue to work to heal herself, then so could I. And in that way, she will always be my superhero. And in that way, I learned about how to take a tragedy and turn it into growth and something of positive change. But the story of TrustLine is not a story of redemption, nor of good triumphing over evil. It is not a story of a single person or someone who has superpowers. The story of TrustLine is a story of human connection, of relationships, of hard work, of many people, of many good hearts who worked together, all together, on something they thought would make a difference. In these times of great trauma, when so many people are suffering, when there is so much fear, we need stories like the amazing journey of TrustLine, how one small step by a very naive and very young mother, how one small step can still be a step on the road to recovery, resilience, and in fact, real systems change. So, TrustLine is as much a story about you, my dear APs and R&Rs, as it is about my family story. You always have been at the ready to respond to parents with what is needed to be responded to. This is for you. So in my case, in the journey of TrustLine, the first step was a single phone call, probably a call in desperation, although I don't remember that, to Bananas, the R&R in Oakland. This call was answered by Betty Cohen. Now, Betty, as many of you know, was the co-director of Bananas. And Bananas had a policy then, maybe they still do now, that everyone, including the directors, shared time on the phones in order to stay in touch with the parents that they served. If you had the privilege of knowing Betty, you know that her heart was huge and that she was very, very skilled in talking with parents. So this young mother, me, younger than my daughter is now, called Bananas in tears. I wanted to stop the person who had shaken my baby almost to death from caring for other children. You see, the judge had set this person free with a conviction of felony child abuse, a $100 fine, and 5 years probation. And at the same time, he allowed her to become a nanny again, because apparently it's good to have a job when you're on probation. It seemed that the judge did not want to deny this nanny her livelihood. I want you to think for a moment about the last phone call you took from a harried, anxious, fearful parent. What would you have said if you had been on the phone with me? I believe that if I called a resource and referral agency today, you would be there for me just like Betty was. It would be you who would have helped me take the next step on the journey, and you would have put on the superhero cape. I'm not going to tell you all the story or all the miracles tonight. There were many. But one thing led to another, and eventually, and by the way, I wrote this before I knew you were coming. One thing led to another, and eventually I met up with Art Agnos. He was an amazing assemblyman. He later became mayor of the city of San Francisco. And he, like many other legislators later did, recognized that what happened to our family could have happened to his. By then, I had met 2 other mothers who had children shaken by in-home providers. Art and his staff, and we 3 mothers became a force. We would walk into a legislator's office, speaking if possible to the legislator, but if not, we would find the person in the office with the child's picture on the desk. And we would tell our stories, and we were very clear about what we wanted. We wanted a way for parents to know that their provider did not have any criminal or child abuse history. It's so amazing for me today to see that the reauthorization of the federal Child Care Development Block Grant requires not only what we set out to provide with TrustLine, but actually more. And when the votes came in hearing after hearing, we would send our legislative supporters 3 red roses and baby's breath for the 3 mothers and the babies of California. I guess what you could say we did back then was some serious parent engagement. Where are my parent voices? Where are my peeps? Because there's some serious parent engagement. Well, most people don't know about the connection between TrustLine and the first authorization of the CCDBG. By the time this was happening, TrustLine had just made the national news. I had actually been on Oprah, yes, it's true, and the other mothers were on Geraldo and many other talk shows to speak. Remember Geraldo? Yeah, I know. to speak to the issue of health and safety concerns in childcare. And many of the mothers that I work with nationally actually went to Washington, D.C. and testified with their children in hand in support of the passage of CCDBG in Congress. Now, the Republican, and this is important because I want you to get, this was a Republican assemblyman who co-authored early TrustLine legislation in California along with a very Democratic counterpart, had been recently elected to Congress as a Newt Gingrich Republican. I learned from the National Center, Women's Law Center, that he wanted TrustLine to succeed so badly in California, where we needed the federal block grant to fund the background checks for low-income families, that he brought the TrustLine data forward to Congress. And I think it was an 18% hit rate at the time. 18% of the people applying had a disqualifying criminal or child abuse history. And while he was completely out of his comfort level, he fought for the passage of the CCDBG in Washington. Now that might be a miracle. But everyone has a miracle story to tell about TrustLine. And everyone in a miracle story has a job to do. Everyone finds there comes a time when you must say yes to what you know your job is. So he later told me that his heart had been won over to become a champion for protecting children from people who should not be caring for them, when Elizabeth, who was probably 8 years old at the time, sang the theme song of the Disney's The Little Mermaid to him. And apparently this was quite an inspirational song. So Cindy can tell you better than I about the many pieces of legislation to expand or to improve TrustLine that followed. For most of them, the committee members had to be typed out to individuals on erasable typing paper. Okay, I'm just saying, have times changed. And speaking of time, because I'm watching my time, there comes a time for any mother, including the mother of TrustLine, as Patty Siegel used to call me, that it's time for me to pass the torch. I think it's time for you to hear from Elizabeth, the inspiration of the California TrustLine. I get to do this. Elizabeth graduated from Stanford with honors. She received her PhD from the University of Arizona, Tucson in philosophy. I know. She has been a keynote speaker around the country, focusing us all on the importance of children's rights, the prevention of child maltreatment, disability rights, and most recently, on the critical nature of interconnection. Liz, I pass the torch and the cape to you. It's time to share your story with my superheroes, the R&Rs and the APs of California. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It is an honor for me to be here, and thank you, Mom. That was a wonderful introduction. I'm not totally sure how I'm going to follow that. The story of how TrustLine came to be. It's as much my story as it is my mother's. And in our own way and time, my mother and I have each had to gather together the often fragile, broken, and knotted strands of our lives and thread them through, hand over hand, weaving a narrative that could nurture hope and change in ourselves and our community. Part of reweaving my story has been to share my experience with people who would listen. I began this early, as far back as age 4, sitting on Art Agnos's lap. He's sitting over there. It's wonderful that he's here tonight. And during one of the TrustLine's first hearings, and the head of the committee at that hearing turned to me and asked if I had anything I wanted to say, and I most certainly did. I eagerly took the microphone and exclaimed, "We need a big rule for grown-ups." So once that big rule for grown-ups was on its way to being a reality, I was 8 years old, and my mom invited Bill Baker to our home. I was prepared. Even then, I understood, perhaps implicitly, the persuasive power of giving voice to my own truth. My mother's journey with TrustLine empowered me to feel, even at that early age, that I was growing into a bright young woman ready to stand. And so I sang the Little Mermaid song, hoping I could reach out beyond the divisions I so strongly felt around me, divisions between the blind and the sighted, which I understood all too well. And incidentally, divisions among political parties, which I knew nothing about. I sang because I wanted so badly to finally feel part of your world. I sang to create connection, and that's exactly what happened. My gift to form authentic connections with others led me to the many opportunities I had as a teen and young adult to deliver keynote addresses at conferences on child abuse prevention across the country. I always began those speeches by sharing the extent of the violence inflicted on me as an infant, and how I struggled to belong, to be accepted as a person with a disability at school, at home, and even within my own heart and mind. As children, how many of you also struggled to find acceptance, longing to be seen for who you are, whether you experienced abuse in your past or faced prejudice due to disability, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, religion, or gender? The list of ways we discriminate is staggering, isn't it? Were you simply a confused and conflicted teenager? It's probably all of you, right? We all have a story to share. Today, I understand that my story does not need to begin with what happened to me. And neither does the story of TrustLine. The makings of TrustLine did not begin with my birth, with my mother's story, or her mother's story, or her mother's story. The story of TrustLine is a story greater than the story of one event, one mother's vision, one life, one family. It has become part of the story of every legislator we met, every R&R agency we collaborated with, that's many of you out here, every parent who was touched by our message or used TrustLine's resources, every child whose safety TrustLine has protected and assured. There is tremendous power in sharing our stories. It allows us to grow in resilience and self-acceptance, and invites us collectively to cultivate compassion for each other, strengthening the bonds of belonging we already share. Stories are powerful because they allow us to see ourselves reflected in the lives of others. They help us to remember that we are all living more or less the same human experience. By encountering and participating in the stories of others' lives, whether past or present, we recognize others as second selves and appreciate just how interconnected we are. When my mother would bring me as a child to TrustLine meetings and events, it was easier for people to realize that what happened to me could happen to anyone, even their own child. They were able to relate to us on a more personal level. Of course, data is also vital when trying to affect social change or respond effectively to the overwhelming numbers of natural and man-made disasters confronting us constantly with more tragedy and more loss. But we must remember that numbers can only speak as numbers. They cannot speak as people. They cannot convey the grief of an already impoverished family who has now lost everything they own. The fear felt by a working mother who has no idea how her children will be cared for now that her affordable child care center burned down. The despair of a mother who just learned that her child was violently shaken and might die. Though data eventually did become a crucial component in TrustLine's conception, my mother initially relied almost exclusively on the power of our family's story, helping others remember that we are all part of one human family. Each of you R&R agencies and alternative payment programs become part of that story, the story of TrustLine. Every time you tell someone about TrustLine, every time you advocate for safe sleep practices, every time you find care for a child, every time you match that child and their temperament with what best meets their needs. By showing up day after day to advocate for our children, we work together to realize a world in which children will no longer be kept in shadows of a problem too complicated to solve, part of a knot too twisted to untie, and therefore left alone. And when one day we realize that none of us are alone, that we all play an integral part in sustaining each other in this interdependent world, we will understand that there is no knot too difficult to untie, that we do not belong to different threads. So the theme for this conference tonight is honoring our superheroes, and I cannot think of a more appropriate description for the people here tonight. I mean this from the bottom of my heart. You do not need to have superpowers to be a superhero. Superheroes are advocates who know change comes from drawing people together rather than driving them apart. Superheroes are leaders who not only tear down barriers, but build bridges. Superheroes, quote, save their communities, not by acting invincible, but by being willing to be vulnerable, willing to tell their stories. And when we allow ourselves to be vulnerable, we become open to forming genuine relationships with others, despite the inherent uncertainty involved. It is this engagement in being vulnerable which is so necessary to making and sustaining authentic connection. We are superheroes not because we are fearless, but because we are willing to face our fears, not because we have learned to be free from the pain of the past, but because we have learned to be free to be the authors of our present. The superheroes I admire are the weavers of connection. They are people who can unwind the knotted woundedness in others, who know how to unravel destructive patterns and reconnect us with our passion and purpose, with the thread of our story which can draw us together. When I was 14, I was chosen to run in the 100th Olympic torch relay. Across the entire country, one beautiful, radiant light was passed from one hand to another and then another. Everyone worked together to carry the Olympic torch, the lighted flame from Atlanta where the Olympic Games were taking place. It took the cooperation of thousands of people willing to run, take up the torch, and pass it on. Each one of us here today has a job to do to ensure that the narrative our children are born into is a story about protection, compassion, love, and belonging. As individuals and as organizations, it is our responsibility to keep the flame alive, to pass the torch to our children and our children's children and to our children's children's children. To help heal the divisions in this terror-ridden and grief-stricken world, even a little is no small thing. Nelson Mandela spoke to the heart of this challenge when he said, "It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us." So I challenge you, my fellow superheroes, to shine your light anyway. And it's okay to be scared. And since we superheroes are here to inspire and light the way for one another, I'll leave you with a poem I wrote called The Song of Belonging. I longed to belong, so I tried crossing out my differences, hoping this is what would mend each great divide. I longed to belong, but felt so separate and so wrong, I sang another person's song and became a sea without a tide. I longed to belong, convinced there was something more to find, and wandered weary and dissatisfied until I stumbled through the door within that led me back inside. And through it all, I laughed and cried, and when I heard you do the same, suddenly my tears dried. And I realized our lives are but a single thread. Our raw moments of connection are the knots tying us together, and from the strands of our own song, we weave the story we become into something beautiful and strong, part of the fabric pattern of the world. And our world is starving for love. We are yearning for meaning, to hear the song of every life, and our children need us to voice what lies within. How else can we leave them their beginnings? How else can we guide them to live by the wonder shining out through their eyes, even when they're old? We long, and all along who we are remains quietly waiting. To be here is your right, so stand up and be strong. You spark a flame from hand to hand. It's your turn to shine your light. So I pass the torch to you tonight. Thank you.
I feel a great joy and a lot of emotion being here and having been invited to this 30th anniversary tribute to TrustLine and to all of you who work in the field of childcare. It's a very special privilege for me to be here. In fact, I was so excited. You're going to meet one of my top people to hear just a minute about how this all came about in Ed McGovern. But we were driving up here, and we were so excited, so joyful, we were speeding. And the highway patrol stopped us. Now you have to remember, in my day, I used to set the salaries for the highway patrol. So I hoped they might know the name on the driver's license, but unfortunately he was a young man and didn't go back 30 years. So I thought I would give him a hint, because I don't like to say, do you know who I am, and all that stuff. So I said, you know, we're in a bit of a hurry. We're rushing to a conference in Sacramento, and I hope to have a chance to see the speaker, the assembly, etc. Kept writing the ticket. So I said, well, maybe he's a Republican. I said, you know, back in the day, I used to work with George Duke-Majan and Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he kept on writing. And you know, I used to work with former Speaker Willie Brown, who was the mayor of San Francisco, and he finished the ticket and handed it to me. And he said, you know, Mr. Agnos, you know a lot of important people, but you really ought to get to know Jack Hawkins. Jack Hawkins, who's he? He says, that's me. And he walked away. Well, we got here. And it was worth everything. And I'm grateful to have been invited as the original author of AB 3608 in 1987. And I want to salute all of you for the work that has been done in the field at large, but also on TrustLine itself. I want to salute the legislators who may not be here, but who added and expanded and made it even a better bill than what we were able to do when we first started 30 years ago. It's a stronger tool today for the protection of our children. But most of all, I salute Meb Phillips, Bonnie Reeves, who's not here, who was one of the originals, and the newest star on our TrustLine red carpet, Elizabeth Phillips. Now, the success of TrustLine can be measured in many, many ways. My choice to measure it is by what has not happened. I measure it in the way that children who have grown up healthy, to live without harm inflicted by anybody hired to nurture, protect them, and care for them. I measure it in the families who have enjoyed watching their children grow up free from any of the damage and scars that might have been left on them by people hired to protect, nurture, and care for them. And Mary Beth and her allies gave extraordinary energy and time and commitment and sacrificed so much so that others would never have to face the sacrifices that they faced. And like many of the mothers involved in TrustLine, Mary Beth did something even more extraordinary, in my opinion. She raised a healthy, magnificent, lovely young woman. Take a good look. Take a good look at this young woman to my right. The world is going to hear from her, but you're first. And so it is indeed proper to honor Mary Beth and Elizabeth, as well as the others who gave so much to be a part of this great mission. We thank them, and we are grateful to them because thousands upon thousands of families and children are protected as a result. Now, let me say that usually when I come to events like this, my wife is with me, but I didn't bring her today. I brought someone else who was very important to me and TrustLine. I would never have heard about this issue were it not for Ed McGovern, who I'm going to ask to come up here for a minute so you can see him. You see, I have never done, Ed, come on up here. You see, I have never done anything in my political career as a mayor or as a state legislator by myself. It was always with the very best idealistic, strong-minded, talented people who worked on my staff and did so much of the work to prepare for the legislation we were about to. And so I was joined in our mission for public service by people like Ed McGovern, who shared my credo that we needed to empower people whose voices were not being heard by those who needed to hear it. And Mary Beth was one of those people, because she didn't live in my district. She was miles away on the other side of the bay in Contra Costa County, but somehow her voice was not being heard until she met Ed McGovern. And I asked him to come here and give you a minute or so about how that all happened. Ed?
Good evening. I'm Cecelia Fisher-Dahms, and I'm the Quality Improvement Administrator at the Department of Education's Early Education and Support Division. And no, I wasn't involved with it 30 years ago. So I don't have all of this history, but I want to acknowledge in the 30 years, to think that even the name that we chose to recognize this registry is the TrustLine registry. That in fact, the relationship that we're trying to ensure is that families can trust who they are, who is providing care for them. And I think that's really significant, that in acknowledging 30 years, it's 30 years of ensuring trust, and that is in fact what our R&Rs, our APs are doing when they are ensuring that care for families. The Department of Education would like to present certificates, only I forgot to bring them. So, and they're beautiful. So to paraphrase, the superintendent, State Superintendent of Education, Tom Torlickson, would like to acknowledge the significant contribution to the young children of California that was put forth by the dedication and perseverance of Mary Beth Phillips, and as expressed so beautifully through her daughter Elizabeth. So if you can imagine, I will do this, and I will make sure that they do get that. But we really would like to acknowledge how significant it is for California. As Mary Beth had mentioned, that when the most recent reauthorization of the Child Care and Development Block Grant went through, California now doesn't have all of the things that it's talking about in terms of fingerprint and background checks and so on. But when I talk to my fellow colleagues in other states who are struggling to meet this new requirement of how do they get their providers and their background checks, and this in some cases might be even to their licensed providers, how do they even start up a system, to think that 10% of the country's early childhood workforce already meets an assurance of that we do not have felons or child abusers who are caring for our children. And that, yes, we're not all the way, I know, Abby, but we are miles ahead, and we're not going to, we aren't having to struggle with trying to bring them because of the pioneering efforts that were done by Mary Beth and her colleagues. So we want to thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Shanice Orum, and I am the Program Administrator over the Child Care Community Care Licensing Division. And I am happy to be here to present on behalf of the Department of Social Services. When the request went around and it came up to me in an email, I said, oh, I'm there because of the relationship that the department has with MED. Over the last couple of years, one of the things that I can piggyback on about Mary Beth and the work that came out of TrustLine is just the work that she's done as a change agent. What we've seen out of the work that's not just with the TrustLine piece of it is that the fact that here it is as a mother that has basically built this platform of advocacy. And it's a model that I personally see other families and other parents can use and can apply. It's a successful model. It's one that we know, coming from community care licensing, we see a lot of different events occurring in our facilities. And to know that when parents are faced with different devastating events, that they're gonna have those rough times. And in those rough times, they're gonna find their voice. And even though TrustLine is accomplished and is done, Mary Beth's work has not ended. And I was very pleased to hear Elizabeth share her story and share what she is advocating for, to kind of take that from her mom. And from that, the health and safety work group is one of the efforts that in which Mary Beth has piggybacked on over the years and have created a voice not only for parents but for advocates such as yourself, and to find a platform to present to departments such as the Department of Education, Department of Social Services, because we need your voice out there. We need for the voice of parents to be heard. A lot of parents that we see may not know the avenues. They know that when they send their child to a provider, they may not even know that it's a licensed provider. They just assume that government is regulating a facility. But the fact that they're in a place that is safe and healthy, that's what's important to the parent, right? And programs like TrustLine and programs such as the Resource Referral and AP programs that are aware of different resources that are out there for parents and different avenues in which they can use to spread messages is one that I applaud you all in your efforts and what you're doing. And for tonight, on behalf of the Department of Social Services, we just want to thank you for the work that you have done and to keep it up. Thank you.
Hello to all of you. It's really hard to follow all of that, but luckily my job is just to raise a toast. So get your glasses out. I do want to say that of all the things that MEB has taught me, the most important is to celebrate your victories, to celebrate your successes, to take the time to recognize that progress has been made. And as Liz said, even if it's just these little steps, all of you all the time are making those kinds of efforts all the time, and they're making a difference. So here's to all of you. but here's especially to Meb and to Liz. They embody the 3 traits that I think of when I think of the most powerful, and there's the first P, powerful advocates. They require passion. They've got it. They require that they are persuasive, and boy, are they ever. Tell you a little story about that from my experience. And the last is that they really persevere. Change does not come easily, nor does it come speedily. And as any of you who have worked in this field know, we've been working a long time. For those of you who are more recent, and I'm happy to bring Liz into the effort, we really want to toast all of you to keep the work going. So here to 30 years of TrustLine.